Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Hello. How are you? All my Dhamma friends. Homage to the Blessed One, the Perfect One, the Supremely Enlightened Ones. Mahasatipatthana Suttam, the Discourse on the Foundations of Mindfulness. Thus, he dwells practicing the mental objects, contemplations on the mental objects internally, or he dwells practicing the mental subjects, contemplations on the mental subjects externally, or he dwells practicing the mental objects, contemplations on the mental subjects, but internally and externally, he dwells practicing the originations, factors, contemplations on the mental subjects, or he dwells practicing the dissolutions, factors, contemplations on the mental subjects, or he dwells practicing but the originations and dissolution factor contemplations on the mental objects, and his mindfulness is established. Thus, there are mental subjects only to the extent necessary for knowledge and mindfulness. He dwells completely independent, not depending on cravings and wrong view, clinging to nothing in the world. Monks, thus among the worlds, practicing the mental objects, contemplations on the mental objects of the seven factors of enlightenment. The Four Noble Truths. Against monks among the world's practicing the mental subjects, contemplations on the mental objects of the Four Noble Truths. Monks, how does amongst the world practicing the mental objects, contemplations on the mental subjects of the Four Noble Truths, monks knows according to reality these sufferings. He knows according to reality This is the origins of sufferings. He knows according to reality. This is the cessations of sufferings. He knows according to reality. This is the path leading to the cessations of sufferings. Monks, what is the novel truth of suffering? But is suffering against is sufferings, that is sufferings, sorrow, lamentations, pains, griefs, and despair are suffering associations with the dislike it is sufferings separations from the like it is sufferings not to get what one wishes is sufferings in brief the five aggregates as objects of clingings are sufferings. Monks, what is birth? The birth of beings belongings to this or that orders of beings, their beings born, their originations, their conceptions, their springing into existence, the many manifestations of the aggregates, the accusations of the sense bases monks. This is called birth. Monks, what is against the teachings of beings belonging to this or that order of beings? Yeah, all is decrepitude, breakings of teeth, grayness of hair, uh, wrinklings of skins, the paling, the the failing of their vital force, the wearings out of their sense faculties. Monk, this is called against. Monks, what is that? The departings and vanishings of beings out of this or that orders of beings their destructions, disappearance, dyings, death, the completions of their life periods, dissolutions of the aggregates, the discardings of the body, the destructions of the controllings faculty of the vital principles. Monks, this is called that. Monks, what is sorrow? The sorrow of wants affected by this or that loss, touched by this or that painful things, the sorrowing the inner deep way. Monks, this is called sorrow. Monks, what is lamentations? The wailings of ones affected by this or that loss, touched by this or that painful things, laments, wailings, and lamentings, the state of wailings and lamentations. Monks, this is called lamentations. Monks, what is pains? The bodily pains, bodily unpleasantness, the painful and unpleasant feelings produced by bodily contacts. Monks, this is called pains. Monks, what is griefs? The mental pains and mental unpleasantness, the painfuls and unpleasant feelings produced by mental contacts. Monks, this is called griefs. Monks, what is despairs? The distress of one's affected by this or that loss, touched by this or that painful things, excessive dejections, a state of being dejected. Monks, this is called despairs. Monks, what is the chavarings of association with the disliked? Uh, whatever undesirables, disagreeables, unpleasant objects, there are visibles, audibles, odorous, testables, and tangibles, or whoever ills wizards, there be who wish one's lots harm, discomfort, and non-release from bonds. It is beings together with them coming in contact, pre, uh, fraternizings, and beings mix with them. Monk, this is called the chavarings of association with the disliked. Monks, what is the chavarings of separations from the liked whatever desirables, agreeables, pleasant objects there are visibles, audibles, odorous, tastables, and tangibles, or whoever wells wishers there be who wish one's welfare, benefit, comfort, and release from bonds such as mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, friends, colleagues, relatives, or blood relations. It is not being together with them, not coming in contact for fraternizing, and not being mixed with them. Monk, this is called the severing of separation from the like it. Monks, what is not to get what one's wishes is severing monks in beings who are subjects to what this wish arises. Oh, that we were not subject to birth. Oh, that no new birth would come to us, but this cannot be got merely by wishing it. This is the suffering of not to get what one wishes is sufferings. Monks in banks who are subjects to aging, this wish arises. Oh, that we were not subjects to aging. Oh, that no agings would come to us, but this cannot be got merely by wishing it. This is the suffering of not to get what one wishes is suffering. Monks in banks who are subject to sickness, this wish arises. Oh, that we were not subjects to sickness. Oh, that no sickness would come to us, but this cannot be got merely by wishing it. This is the suffering of not to get what one wishes is suffering. Monks in banks who are subject to that, this wish arises. Oh, that we were not subjects and to that. Oh, that no, that will come to us, but this cannot be got merely by wishing it. This is the suffering of not to get what one wishes is suffering. Monks in banks who are subject to sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair. This wish arises, oh, that we were not subject to sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair. Oh, that no sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair will come to us, but this cannot be got merely by wishing it. This is the sufferings of not to get what one wishes is sufferings. Monks, what is in brief the pipe aggregates of clingings are sufferings. They are the aggregates of clingings to material form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousnesses. Amongst this is called, in brief, the five aggregates of clingings are sufferings. Amongst this is called the noble truth of sufferings. Monks, what is the noble truth of the origins of sufferings? It is that cravings which gives reach to further reward and bound up with pleasure, and last finds ever a fresh delight now here, now there, to with the sensual cravings, the craving for existence and the cravings for non-existence. Monks, where does these cravings keep reaching and getting rooted? Whatever in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps reaching and getting rooted. What in the world is delightful and pleasurable? I in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein this craving keeps reaching and getting rooted. Here in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein this craving keeps arising and getting rooted. Nose in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein this craving keeps arising and getting rooted. Uh, tongue in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein these cravings keeps reaching and getting rooted. Body in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein these cravings keeps reaching and getting rooted. Minds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein this craving keeps arising and getting rooted. Visual forms in the world are delightful and pleasurable. Therein this craving keeps arising and getting rooted. Sounds in the world are delightful and pleasurable. Therein these cravings keeps arising and getting rooted. Smells in the world are delightful and pleasurable. Wherein these cravings keeps erasing and getting rotate. Tastes in the world are delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps enriching and getting rotate. Tangible objects in the world are delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps enriching and getting rotate. Mental objects in the world are delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps enriching and getting rotate. I consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps enriching and getting rotate. Your consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps enriching and getting rotate. No consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this cravings keeps enriching and getting rotate. Thanks consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps enriching and getting rotate. Body consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keep arising and getting rotate. Mind's consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. I context in the world is delightful and pleasurable therein. These cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. Your context in the world is delightful and pleasurable therein. These cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. No context in the world is delightful and pleasurable therein. This craving keeps reaching and getting sorted. Thanks context the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps reaching and getting rotate. The body context in the world is delightful and uh, cravings keeps getting rotate. Mind's context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps reaching and getting rotate. Feelings born of eye contact in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps reaching and getting rotate. Feeling born of your context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. Feelings born of nose contact in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. Feelings born of tongues context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. Feelings born of body context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. Feelings born of, of minds context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps reaching and getting rotate. Perceptions of visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Perceptions of sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps uh, arising and getting rotate. Perceptions of smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Perception of taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Perceptions of touches in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Perceptions of mental objects in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Will for visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Will for sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keep arising and getting rotate. Will for smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Uh, will for taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keep arising and getting rotate. Will for touches in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Will for mental objects in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Cravings for visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Cravings for sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Cravings for smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Cravings for taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Craving for touches in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keep arising and getting rotate. Cravings for mental objects in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Thought for visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Thought for sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Thought for smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Thoughts for taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps arising and getting rotate. Thought for touches in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps arising and getting rotate. Thought for mental objects in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keep erasing and getting rotated. Discourse thought for visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. There in this craving keeps erasing and getting rotated. Discursive thought for sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. There in this craving keeps erasing and getting rotated. Discursive thought for smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, these cravings keeps erasing and getting rotated. Discursive thought for taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Therein, this craving keeps erasing and getting rotated. Discursive thought for touches in the world is delightful and ple- pleasurables. Wherein this craving keeps reaching and getting rotated. Discursive thought for mental objects in the world is delightful and measurable. Wherein this craving keeps reaching and getting rotated. Monk, this is the noble truth of the origins of sufferings. Monks, what is the noble truth of the cessations of sufferings? It is the total extinction by the removals, forsakings, and discardings of the freedoms from and the non attachments to that very cravings. Monks, where is these cravings finally abandon it, and where does these cravings finally cease? Whatever in the world is delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. What in this world is delightful and pleasurable, eyes in the world is delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Years in the world is delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Nose in the world is delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Tongues in the world is delightful and pleasurable, there uh, therein these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Body in the world is delightful and pleasurable, therein these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Minds in the world is delightful and pleasurable, therein these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Visual forms in the world are delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Sounds in the world are delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there is ultimately ceases. Smells in the world are delightful and pleasurable, there in these cravings is finally abandoned, there it ultimately ceases. Tastes in the world are delightful and pleasurable, they are in these cravings is finally abandoned, they are it ultimately CSS tangible objects in the world are delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately CSS minds objects in the world are delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately CSS I consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. There in this cravings is finally abandoned. There it ultimately ceases. Here our consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. Here in this cravings is finally abandoned. There it ultimately ceases. No consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. There in this cravings is finally abandoned. There it ultimately ceases. Thanks. Consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. There in this cravings is finally abandoned. There it ultimately ceases. Body consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. Mind's consciousness in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. I context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. Their context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are ultimately ceases. Delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. Thanks context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. There in this craving is there it ultimately ceases. Body context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in this cravings is finally abandoned. There it ultimately mind context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. The feelings forms of context in the world delightful is delightful and pleasurable. They are in this craving is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately CSS, the feelings formed of context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in this craving is finally abandoned. Ultimately, CSS, the feelings of no context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in this cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately CSS, the feelings born of tongue context in the world is delightful, pleasurable. They are in this cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately chases the feelings born of body context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately the feelings born of mind context in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. The perceptions of visual forms in the world uh, is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. The perceptions of sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately ceases. The perceptions of smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in this cravings is finally abandon it. They are it ultimately. Yes. The perceptions of taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. Yes. The perceptions of tasks in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The perceptions of mental objects in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The will for visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are it. These cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The will for sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The wills for smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The wills for taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. Wills for taste in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The will for mental objects in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The cravings for visual forms in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The cravings for sounds in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The cravings for smells in the world is delightful and pleasurable. They are in these cravings is finally abandoned. They are it ultimately. CSS. The cravings